Why Germany lost the battle for North Africa, a detailed analysis. Few generals in military history have garnered the level of respect and admiration that Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, commanded. Despite serving under the Third Reich, Rommel's leadership in North Africa made him a legendary figure, praised not just by his allies, but even by his enemies. When Rommel arrived in North Africa in 1941, it marked a significant shift in the dynamics of the theatre. His tactical brilliance and the exploits of his panzers solidified his reputation and made him Hitler's favoured general. However, despite his early successes, Rommel's campaign in North Africa ultimately ended in defeat. This analysis explores the complex reasons behind the Axis failure in North Africa and how the Allies eventually expelled Rommel and his forces from the continent. The initial situation in North Africa. By January 1941, the British were on the verge of a decisive victory in North Africa. The Western Desert Force, primarily composed of British and Commonwealth troops, had consistently outmaneuvered and defeated Italian forces, capturing the strategic port of Tobruk and pushing towards Tripoli. Mussolini's North African Empire was collapsing, prompting him to appeal to Adolf Hitler for assistance. Although Hitler considered North Africa a secondary theatre, the potential collapse of Italy, a key Axis ally, forced his hand. On January 11, 1941, Hitler issued Directive No. 22, ordering the reinforcement of Italian positions in North Africa, which led to the dispatch of General Erwin Rommel and his Afrika Korps to the region. Rommel's arrival marked a turning point. His orders were to act defensively and prevent further British advances, but Rommel's aggressive nature led him to take the initiative. In March 1941, sensing an opportunity, he launched an unexpected offensive against the British-led 8th Army, which was exhausted from previous battles. Rommel's audacity paid off, as he quickly outflanked British forces, pushing them back into Cyrenaica. The only significant resistance came from the Australian defenders in Tobruk, who held out despite repeated attempts by Rommel to capture the port. The challenges of supply and logistics. Rommel's early victories in North Africa were achieved with limited resources, a testament to his tactical genius. However, the further his forces advanced, the more stretched his supply lines became. North Africa's vast deserts and lack of infrastructure made it difficult to maintain the flow of supplies, especially fuel, which was critical for the mechanized warfare that characterized the campaign. The British, controlling the Mediterranean through Malta, further complicated Rommel's logistical situation by disrupting Axis supply convoys. Rommel's supply issues were a constant source of frustration. Despite his repeated pleas for more resources, the German High Command prioritized the Eastern Front, where the bulk of the war effort was concentrated. This disparity in resource allocation became a critical factor in the eventual defeat of the Afrika Korps. According to some estimates, Rommel received only about 40% of the supplies he needed between January and August 1942, severely limiting his operational capabilities. Even when supplies did reach North Africa, getting them to the front lines was another challenge. The lack of trucks and the sheer distance from ports to the battlefield meant that much-needed fuel, ammunition and food often arrived too late, or in insufficient quantities. Rommel's forces, though often superior in tactics and morale, were frequently hampered by these logistical difficulties, which the Allies, with their better-developed supply lines, were able to exploit. Rommel's command style and strategic miscalculations. Rommel's leadership style was one of his greatest strengths, but it also contributed to his eventual downfall. He was known for leading from the front, often placing himself in the thick of the action. This approach inspired his troops and enabled him to make quick decisions based on the realities of the battlefield. However, it also meant that he sometimes lost sight of the broader strategic picture. One of the most notable examples of this was during the dash to the wire in late November 1941. Rommel, sensing a decisive moment, personally led the 21st Panzer Division in a daring attempt to break through British lines and reach the Egyptian border. While the operation initially made significant progress, it ultimately failed because Rommel's forces ran out of fuel and supplies, forcing them to divert to Bardia to resupply. This miscalculation allowed the British to regroup and counterattack, costing Rommel what might have been a narrow victory. Rommel's reliance on bold, improvisational tactics worked well against an unprepared and disorganized enemy. However, as the British adapted and improved their own strategies, these tactics became less effective. British commanders, particularly General Bernard Montgomery, who replaced Claude Auchinleck, began to counter Rommel's maneuvers with more disciplined and methodical operations. By the time of the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942, the British had developed a strong defensive position and had amassed significant numerical superiority, both in men and materiel. Montgomery's cautious approach, combined with superior intelligence from ultra-intercepts of German communications, ensured that Rommel's attempts at surprise were largely neutralized. The impact of Allied air superiority. One of the critical factors in the Allied victory in North Africa was the gradual but decisive shift in air superiority. Early in the campaign, Rommel could count on reliable support from the Luftwaffe, which provided crucial air cover and interdiction against British forces. However, as the campaign progressed, the Luftwaffe's resources were increasingly diverted to other theatres, including the Eastern Front and the defence of Germany itself. Meanwhile, the British Royal Air Force, RAF, concentrated its efforts on supporting the Eighth Army, gradually gaining control of the skies over the desert. By August 1942, the RAF had achieved air superiority over the Luftwaffe in North Africa, allowing for more effective bombing raids on Axis supply lines and positions. This air superiority was instrumental in disrupting Rommel's already precarious logistics and contributed to the attrition of his forces. The constant air attacks not only damaged Axis infrastructure, but also had a significant psychological impact on Rommel's troops, many of whom were already suffering from exhaustion and illness due to the harsh desert conditions. The strategic importance of North Africa. One of the critical reasons for Germany's failure in North Africa was the theatre's relative importance within the broader context of World War II. For Adolf Hitler, North Africa was always a secondary front. His primary focus was on the Eastern Front, where he believed the war would be won or lost. Consequently, Rommel's forces in North Africa were never given the level of priority or resources that were necessary for a sustained and successful campaign. The Allies, on the other hand, placed significant strategic importance on North Africa. For Britain, in particular, the North African campaign was critical. The Suez Canal was a vital lifeline for maintaining communication and supply routes to the British Empire's colonies in India and the Far East. Additionally, the defeat of the Axis in North Africa would allow the Allies to open a second front in Europe, beginning with the invasion of Sicily and Italy in 1943. This would relieve pressure on the Soviet Union and hasten the overall defeat of Nazi Germany. The disparity in how the two sides viewed the campaign was reflected in the allocation of resources. While Rommel was forced to operate with limited supplies and reinforcements, the British and their allies ensured that the Eighth Army was well supported. This included the introduction of newer, more effective tanks, such as the American M4 Sherman, which outclassed many of the German and Italian tanks used by the Afrika Korps. The Allies' superior logistics and supply lines, combined with the growing effectiveness of their air and naval forces, gradually tipped the balance in their favour. The role of Italian forces and multinational cooperation. Another factor contributing to the Axis defeat in North Africa was the performance of the Italian forces. While Italian troops made up a significant portion of Rommel's army, their effectiveness was often hampered by poor equipment and low morale. Rommel frequently blamed the Italians for his setbacks, arguing that their lackluster performance placed additional pressure on his German troops. However, it is also worth noting that Italian forces played a crucial role in many of Rommel's early successes, particularly during the initial stages of the campaign. The challenges of multinational cooperation were not unique to the Axis forces. The British-led Eighth Army was itself a multinational force, comprising units from Britain, Australia, New Zealand, India, South Africa, and other countries. Coordination between these diverse forces was often difficult, especially given the different backgrounds and personalities of the officers in command. However, as the campaign progressed, the Allies developed more effective ways to integrate their forces, improving communication and cooperation across national lines. the final campaigns, and the defeat of the Afrika Korps. By late 1942, the tide had decisively turned against the Axis in North Africa. The Second Battle of El Alamein, fought from October 23 to November 11, 1942, marked the beginning of the end for Rommel's forces. Despite putting up a determined resistance, the Afrika Korps was gradually worn down by the relentless pressure from Montgomery's Eighth Army. The battle was characterized by intense fighting, particularly around the heavily defended German positions at Kidney Ridge and the Axis minefields. Montgomery's strategy of attrition, combined with the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Allied forces, eventually forced Rommel to retreat. On November 4th, Rommel disobeyed Hitler's orders to stand and fight to the last man, and instead began a withdrawal towards Tunisia. This decision, while tactically sound, marked the beginning of the end for the Axis in North Africa. Rommel's forces, now caught between the advancing Eighth Army and the Anglo-American forces that had landed in Morocco and Algeria as part of Operation Torch, were gradually pushed back into Tunisia. The final phase of the North African campaign saw the Axis forces attempting to hold a defensive line in Tunisia. However, the mountainous terrain, combined with the overwhelming superiority of Allied forces, made this an impossible task. By May 1943, the remaining Axis forces in North Africa, including the remnants of the Afrika Korps, were forced to surrender. The campaign had ended in total defeat for Germany and its Italian allies, with significant consequences for the broader war effort. The legacy of the North African campaign, the defeat of the Axis in North Africa, had far-reaching implications for the outcome of World War II. It marked the first significant defeat of German forces in the war and provided a much-needed boost to Allied morale. The victory in North Africa also allowed the Allies to shift their focus to the invasion of Europe, beginning with the landings in Sicily and Italy in 1943. This second front in Europe would eventually lead to the liberation of Western Europe and the defeat of Nazi Germany in 1945. The North African campaign also highlighted the importance of logistics, air power, and multinational cooperation in modern warfare. While Rommel's tactical brilliance was undeniable, the campaign ultimately demonstrated that even the most skilled commanders could not win without adequate resources and support. The campaign also underscored the limitations of the Axis alliance, particularly the disparity in capabilities between German and Italian forces, and the challenges of coordinating a multinational effort. In conclusion, the reasons for Germany's defeat in North Africa were complex and multifaceted. They included strategic miscalculations, logistical challenges, the growing effectiveness of Allied forces, and the relative importance placed on the theatre by the Axis and the Allies. While Rommel's leadership and tactics earned him a place in military history, they were not enough to overcome the inherent disadvantages faced by the Axis in North Africa. The campaign serves as a powerful reminder of the broader realities of war, where success often depends as much on strategic planning, logistics, and cooperation as on battlefield prowess.